In this video, I'd like to talk about both the fluid components in our body and also somewhat related to what we were talking about in the last video, or very related, I should say, is glucose uptake in the cells. So let's start with the fluid components in our body. First off, imagine that this board is the human body. And these are some of the organs, certainly not all of the organs in the body, with some of the cells in the body. Admittedly, this is totally unrealistic because this is not really how the body looks, but it's going to work for us right now. So we have the heart, 2 lungs, an eye, brain, muscles, the big toe, and cells. And I like to incorporate the big toe a lot in my lectures because, one, it seems like a fairly meaningless structure within our body that is compared to something like the heart or the brain, even our eyes. But it's also one of the furthest things, dare I say, the furthest thing away from the heart. So the majority of our body is composed of fluid. Roughly 65% of our body is composed of fluid that contains water, it contains nutrients like carbohydrates, amino acids, fatty acids. These are building blocks and nutrients and energy sources for our body. The fluid also contains ions like sodium, potassium, calcium, and we can break up the fluid into 2 broad categories: the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. The intracellular fluid is the fluid that we find within our body cells. Intracellular fluid. And believe it or not, that makes up 2/3 of all the fluid in our body. That is to say, these cells, which are microscopic, and I should point out that the cells aren't really oriented this way in the body, just floating around like this. Certainly, there are some immune cells that kind of just reside in tissues like this. But cells make up our tissues, and we have 4 broad tissue categories in our body. We have nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, connective tissue, and muscle tissue like we see right here. And tissues are composed of like cells with a common function. So while there may be some isolated, random surveilling cells within our body, they're generally making up tissues, say like the tissue that makes up the big toe. And there's cells that make up the lungs, the heart, the eye, the brain. All the organs and tissues within our body are composed of cells. And within those cells is fluid known as intracellular fluid that we can also refer to as cytosol. Okay, so if 2/3 of the fluid in our body is sequestered within cells, that means that the other 1/3 makes up the extracellular fluid. So where is that fluid? Well, blood plasma running through our blood vessels, being pumped out of the hearts. Blood plasma, which is a huge component of our blood, and if we wanted to say specifically the serum of our blood plasma, is fluid. It's primarily water, but it has ions, it has nutrients, it has waste products, very similar to the intracellular fluid. But one of the main contributors or biggest components of the extracellular fluid is blood plasma. Interstitial fluid, that is the fluid between body cells. So we have blood plasma, we have interstitial fluid, and there's a whole host of other fluids in the body. There is lymph fluid, which is very similar to blood plasma. We have serous fluid that protects and bathes many of our organs in our body. For example, around our lungs, we find pleural fluid, which is a type of serous fluid. Around our heart, we have pericardial fluid. The brain is surrounded by cerebral spinal fluid. There's fluid in the eyes that are part of the extracellular fluid, or the ECF. Aqueous humor and vitreous humor of the eye are components of the extracellular fluid. So in short, any fluid that is not within body cells makes up the extracellular fluid. Let's talk about glucose uptake, because glucose uptake does involve the extracellular fluid and it does involve the intracellular fluid. So in review, in our last video, we talked about the release of insulin from pancreatic beta cells. So once again, we have the pancreas, and here's a expanded image of the beta cell, which once again resides in the islets of Langerhans of the pancreas. Insulin helps regulate blood glucose levels. More specifically, insulin is released during times of elevated blood glucose levels. The process we outlined was calcium-induced exocytosis, which we see right here. It was the influx of glucose moving into the cell, eventually depolarized the cell, calcium came in, and then calcium facilitated the release of insulin, and that's what we see right here moving into the bloodstream. Recall that insulin is a hormone, and a hormone is a signaling molecule that travels through the bloodstream. So that's what we see right here. Here's a blood vessel with insulin traveling through it. So the process of exocytosis, which generally speaking releases some sort of signaling molecule from a cell, though there are exceptions to that, releasing a signaling molecule into the cell, in this case insulin, from the beta cell into the blood. The role of insulin is to facilitate glucose uptake, which we see right here. Glucose uptake occurs at the tissues. Glucose uptake is not happening at the pancreas. And that's not totally true because glucose does move into the cells of the pancreas, so one might call that glucose uptake, but when we're talking about insulin-dependent glucose uptake, that certainly is not happening at the pancreas. Glucose uptake happens primarily in muscle tissue or muscle cells, in fat cells, and cells of the liver. And I will admit that the term glucose uptake is a bit confusing. It was confusing to me for a long time. All it is saying is that glucose is moving from the blood plasma, directly into our tissue cells. So in this case, into the cells of our muscle. Once again, there are certain cells that are primarily insulin dependent. Let's just use muscle as an example. We also mentioned the liver and fat cells. The basic premise behind this is we don't want tissues and cells like muscle cells to be utilizing glucose or using glucose at the expense of another organ that needs glucose all the time. And that organ is right in here in your cranium, the brain. The brain needs a constant supply of glucose. You don't have enough glucose in your body, your glucose levels diminish, say, by 50%. Your mentation decreases accordingly as well. So we only want our muscle cells to be utilizing glucose when there is excess glucose in the body. That is to say, when there's sufficient glucose going to the brain, then we can distribute glucose to other tissues in our body. And that's what insulin does. Insulin regulates when or if the muscle cells can gain access to that glucose. In the absence of insulin, can our muscle cells gain glucose, have glucose uptake moving into their cells? Absolutely. All you need to do is exercise. So we'll talk about this when we delve more into the endocrine system, which is the system that involves hormones such as insulin. But working muscle actually doesn't require insulin for glucose uptake. But in the absence of that exercise, we need insulin for glucose uptake. So let's talk about and look at how glucose uptake actually is carried out. Okay, glucose uptake once again is the movement of glucose from the blood into our body cells. Insulin-dependent glucose uptake is the exact same thing, but it requires the aid of insulin to open up gates within cells to allow glucose to get into those cells. So remember, we have, let me get out of the way here. We have insulin released from the pancreas into our blood. Now here, these three cells right here are muscle cells, and muscle cells are insulin dependent. That is to say, during times when exercise is not occurring, muscle cells require insulin to facilitate glucose uptake. So we do not have any insulin bound to this receptor right here. So I should point out that all signaling molecules or ligands, and insulin being a hormone is a signaling molecule, all signaling molecules eventually, wherever they're going, require some sort of docking station or receptor to carry out their activities. So this is the receptor for insulin right here. It's on a muscle cell. Also in this cell, we have a secretory vesicle. And this secretory vesicle is different than the one we looked at in the pancreatic beta cell, and it's actually different than most secretory vesicles in the body. This secretory vesicle, as you may notice, has nothing in it. There is a membrane that makes up the secretory vesicle, and there are channels in that membrane, and specifically, these are glucose channels. But these glucose channels aren't doing any good because, one, there's no glucose in that cell, and that's probably not a fair statement. There's probably some glucose in the cell, but there's not as much as this cell may need. And more importantly, we need these glucose channels in the cell membrane of the cell because the glucose, which we see in orange here floating through the blood, needs to move from the blood into these muscle cells. But that is not going to happen unless insulin is bound to this receptor. Once insulin leaves the blood, moves into the interstitial space, otherwise known as the interstitial fluid. Once insulin binds to this receptor, it's facilitating the process of exocytosis of this secretory vesicle to the periphery of the cell. To be clear, it's exocytosis only because this vesicle right here is moving to the periphery and fusing with the cell membrane. And as it moves over here, the membrane of the secretory vesicle eventually combines with the overall plasma membrane of the cell, which we see right here. So we have this pink membrane of the secretory vesicle and the black plasma membrane of the cell. Now here we can see the pink membrane from the secretory vesicle and the black plasma membrane of the cell. They have fused together. And by doing so, these glucose channels remain in this membrane. So we didn't lose the glucose channels when exocytosis happened. We didn't lose the glucose channels when the pink membrane fused with the black membrane. So now the glucose channels are in place, and now that allows glucose to move from the blood into this interstitial space directly into the cell via facilitated diffusion. Glucose is merely diffusing from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration in the cell. Glucose is a polar molecule. All polar molecules require channels, and this is how insulin facilitates glucose uptake in muscle cells, fat cells, and liver cells, among others.